I think pretty much everyone has run into this at some point. The components folder slowly turns into a dumping ground. Share components, domain-specific business components, page-specific pieces, all of that ends up in the same place. And while the project is small, it feels like, yeah, whatever, not a big deal. It's just a few more files. But what happens when the project gets big? When components already has hundreds of different components? What happens when you need to add a new variations of some business entity, like posts? And the most important question, how do you build an extensible architecture that doesn't start falling apart as the project grows? If you watch this video till the end, we are gonna work through each of those questions with examples. We'll talk about where the atomic design methodology makes sense, where features-led design helps, and where simply better to keep components close to the page. And separately, I'll show you why the modules folder exists and why I put business entities there. So did I get you interested? Then check if you're subscribed to the channel, hit the like button and let's get started. Hello, my name is Eugene and I am Principal Front Engineer. Today I want to talk about organizing the most important part of front-end applications, components. But before we get into extensible architecture, we need to understand why we even need it in the first place. Is there a real pain teams run into when they try to place components? Let's break it down. Modern front-end frameworks give you a lot of freedom when it comes to folder and component structure. Some give you more of that freedom, like React, and some give you less, like Angular. But no matter which framework you choose, the tasks stay the same. You need to build an architecture where, when you add a new business entity, it doesn't feel like it landed in the wrong place. I'm gonna use Next.js for the example, but the approach itself is entirely coupled to the React ecosystem. What matters here isn't a specific framework, but the placement model, responsibility, context, and level of reuse. Let's go back to the example from the beginning of the video, where the components folder has a flat structure and contains both shared components and components tied to a specific business entity. In general, this approach works, but only if the project is small. In my case, I already have 3 full modules: users, posts, and comments, and each of them has its own set of components. And this is where we hit the first problem. To create a card for each module, we need a reusable component. But as a result, we get this picture where an abstract low-level component and high-level domain component sit on the exact same level. You might ask, what's the problem with that? The problem is that once abstract and domain components start living in the same folder, the structures stop reflecting the level of responsibility. Just by looking at where the component lives, you can no longer tell what you are dealing with: a basic UI building block, a sheer composition, or a piece of specific business module. As a result, the components folder loses its architecture meaning, and with that, it becomes almost impossible to build clean and honest re-export facades, because the public API of the layer starts mixing things with different levels of abstraction and responsibility. But that's only half the problem. Now imagine you need to rename a module, or remove it completely. How many tails, imports, references, and related components are you gonna have to find just to avoid leaving behind that code? Unnecessary dependencies and artifacts of the old structure. On top of that, I added one more pain for Next.js developers. When your components are split into server only, client only, and shared, a flat architecture regularly starts causing problems at the build and import level, and figuring out what exactly broke becomes noticeably harder, because all it takes is one used client component and the app in a shared barrel file, and the runtime bandwidth of the layer starts getting mixed together. But let's think about it. Why keep the flat structure at all if we can create a folder, for example post, and put all components related to the post there, right? Basically, we are doing a kind of collocation. The problem is that this is more of an attempt to treat the symptom than an attempt to fix the root cause. Locally, yes, we do solve the collocation problem, because the whole idea says that everything related to an entity should live next to that entity. But here's the catch. We only solve it inside components. What happens at the level of the entire application? In the components folder, we now have posts. But then in API, we're also gonna have posts. And at some point in helpers, we probably want to create posts as well, because domain helpers will show up there too, right? And this is where you start getting the feeling that something is off. The fact that we implemented collocation locally for components doesn't solve the problem at the system level. That's why I introduced the modules folder in my architecture, where collocation is implemented fully. Everything related to a specific business entity lives in one place instead of being spread across technical folders. We can literally delete a module and not leave tails all over the application. But this is a completely different story. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in application architecture, and I'll think about how to make the topic interesting for you as well. Now that we've talked through the problem, possible solutions, and architecture approaches around it, let's move to the version I personally prefer to use in my projects. So in my case, the components folder consists of 3 parts. In a way, this is my interpretation of atomic design methodology, but with a few important differences. The main idea I'm pushing is this. When you create a shared component, the place where it belongs should be obvious. If after creating a component, you have to think for too long about where exactly to put it, the architecture isn't doing its job. Architecture should reduce uncertainty, not create more of it. In other words, the main job of architecture is not to make life harder for developers, it's the opposite. It should make development easier and make the system predictable. Look, let's take classic atomic design. You have atoms, molecules, organisms, and so on. Yes, modern interpretations allow you to name these things however you want, but the core idea stays the same. Smaller blocks build bigger blocks. But let's answer one simple question. We have a card. Just a card. Where do we put it? In molecules? In organisms? The problem is that a card can be very simple, or it can be very complex. It can have multiple parts and its own internal structure, but still remain a complete thing on its own. And this is where the metaphorical model starts to break down. Instead of making the component's place obvious, it makes you argue about what it is: a molecule, an organism, or something in between. And you end up in a strange situation. The time you spend discussion where to put the component starts comparing with the time it took to build the component itself. And this is exactly where the principle I consider essential becomes very clear. If the placement of a component is not obvious, the architecture needs to change. That's how the structure was born. Icons are the most independent layer. They don't know anything about the application. They don't depend on anything, and they can be used anywhere. Then comes UI. These are the most basic, sheer entities that everything else is built from. Most of the time, they are very simple, often just wrappers around a single tag, and when needed, they can even be implemented as compound components. To understand whether a component belongs to UI, ask yourself one simple question. Is it a basic reusable building block with no connection to a specific business entity? If not, it has 2 compositions: Essentially, compositions are ready-made shared components built from UI, icons, and their own logic. They can contain as many texts as needed. That part doesn't matter at all. And there's one important point here. Compositions are not an attempt to create a universal monster for every possible use case. Quite the opposite. The goal is to extract complete shared compositions that actually make sense at the application level. Very often, these components are designed through compound components. You don't try to build one universal card. Instead, you split it into parts and export those parts, so the final consumer can decide which pieces they actually need. That's exactly why compositions don't turn into chaos. This is not endless nesting of abstractions inside other abstractions. It's a layer of complete shared compositions that are later used in pages, features, and business modules. I'm not gonna stop on this in detail, because I already have a separate video on designing extensible components. There I go deep into compound components, slots, and page compositions. I leave the link in the description and in the pinned comment. But that's not everything when it comes to organizing components. As said before, compositions are a ready-made set of blocks you can use to assemble a business entity, a feature, or a page. And most importantly, the modules folder encapsulates all the logic related to a specific business entity. We don't keep that logic in the global components folder, because that would blur the boundaries. We intentionally separate high-level domain components from low-level shared components that the whole application is built from. But you may ask a fair question. Where do we store unique components for a specific page? In modules? Nope. This is where we remember collocation again. For example, let's take a post details page. To understand how code should be organized in the context of this page, imagine it's a local storage room that belongs only to that page. Access to the storage room is closed from the outside. In other words, you don't export or import from the outside the internal components or any other logic of a specific page. Otherwise, you again create extra and non-obvious dependencies between parts of the application. And that, in turn, brings the architecture back into pain, because the component is technically not shared, but changing it suddenly affects different parts of the application. And the worst part is that, by looking at the structure, this isn't obvious at all. But you can say, and you'll be right, that there are cases where pages belong to different business entities, but have the same display model. For example, a browse page. It can contain shared pieces that are not shared across the whole application, but also don't belong to one specific model. So where do we put them? And the answer is simple. Right next to the group of pages, before you can go down into a specific page, you can create a components folder. Components from this folder are not imported from the outside, but they can be reused as a shared pieces inside that specific page scope. So this is not users, not posts, and not any other business entity. These are components that describe the common structure of a certain type of page. And finally, I want to touch on one more place where components can and should live. I have a models folder, but I also have a features folder. The difference is simple. Modules are tied to the business entities of the application, while features cover a specific application need without being tied to a business entity. A perfect example is pagination, and both directories implement collocation, just at different layers. Modules group everything around the business entity, while features group everything around a reusable application capability. That's it for today. If you found this video interesting, hit the like button. And if you don't wanna miss future videos, subscribe to the channel. If there's a specific topic you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. Wishing you clean systems and good projects. See you in the next video.